The morning came quietly, the way mornings do when something important is about to end. London was still half asleep, its streets wrapped in a thin grey mist that rolled in from the Thames and settled over the rooftops like a soft blanket. Inside Kensington Palace, however, there was no sleeping. The lights had been on since before dawn. Soft footsteps moved through long corridors. Staff members spoke in hushed voices, as if raising their voices might make what was happening feel more real. Prince. William stood at the tall window of his private study, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on the gardens below. The trees were bare. The last of autumn had stripped them clean, and they stood like quiet witnesses in the pale morning light. He did not move for a long time. He just looked. There was something about the stillness of those gardens that matched the stillness inside him, a deep, hollow quiet that he had no words for yet. Catherine, Princess of Wales, was down the hall in her dressing room. She sat before the mirror, but she was not looking at her reflection. She was looking at her hands, folded in her lap, still and calm. Her lady-in-waiting stood nearby, not speaking, not pressing. She had learned long ago that there were moments when the princess needed silence more than anything else. This was one of them. The children had already been told, in the gentlest way possible. George, Charlotte, and Louis had been sat down the previous evening, the curtains drawn, the room warm and softly lit. William and Catherine had chosen their words with tremendous care. They had been honest as parents can be, when the truth carries weight that small shoulders were never meant to bear. George had gone very still when he heard. Charlotte had reached for her mother's hand without a word. Louis, the youngest, had leaned against his father's arm and fallen quiet in a way that was older than his years. Now the morning had arrived, and with it the weight of what was to come. The public did not yet know the full shape of what was unfolding. There had been news, of course. There is always news when it comes to the royal family. Headlines had appeared and disappeared. Speculation had bloomed and faded. But nothing had prepared anyone for what was about to be announced. Nothing could have. Because this was not a story about duty or ceremony or protocol. This was a story about two people, a husband and a wife, a father and a mother who had carried an enormous burden together for years, and who were now facing a moment that no amount of royal training could fully prepare you for. Catherine had been unwell. That much had been known. But the depth of what she had faced, the quiet battles fought behind closed doors, the long nights and the slow mornings, that was something she had protected fiercely. She had not wanted to be defined by illness. She had not wanted the world to look at her with pity. She had wanted always to continue to show up, to serve, to be present for the people who needed her. And she had done exactly that. For as long as she possibly could, William had been at her side through all of it. That was not something that needed to be said publicly. It simply was. He had sat beside her in hospital rooms and held her hand in the dark. He had stood tall in public so that she did not have to carry the weight of appearances alone. He had been a husband in the truest sense of the word, not in the way that the world sometimes imagined royalty to function, but in the raw and private and completely human sense. Now they were preparing to step before the cameras. Together one last time in this particular chapter of their lives. The farewell was not a goodbye to everything. It was a farewell to something specific, a role, a period, a version of their lives that had defined them for so long. And that made it, in its own way, harder than a simple ending. The palace communications team had worked through the night preparing the statement. It had been rewritten many times. Every word had been considered, turned over, questioned, refined. William had read each draft carefully, making small but deliberate changes because the words mattered to him. He did not want anything that felt performed or scripted. He wanted the truth, wrapped carefully enough to protect the children, but honest enough to honor everything that had been lived. A senior aide knocked softly on the study door. William turned from the window. "Sir, everything is ready whenever you are." He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and put it on with the careful movements of a man who was buying himself a few more seconds. He straightened the collar. He looked once more at the gardens, then he walked down the hall to find Catherine. She was standing when he reached her, already dressed, composed in that way she had always been that remarkable. Quiet composure that had drawn the world to her from the very beginning. But when she saw him in the doorway, something in her face shifted. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would break anyone. Just a small, real shift, the kind that only happens between two people who have known each other through the full weight of life. He crossed the room. He took her hands in his. They did not say anything for a moment. They did not need to. Outside, the city was beginning to wake. Cars were moving. People were starting their days entirely unaware that inside this palace, something deeply human was quietly taking place. A man and a woman, standing together, holding hands. Breathing, William looked at her and said very softly, "We do this together." She nodded. Her eyes were bright but steady, and so they moved side by side toward the door. The room where they would make their appearance had been carefully arranged. It was not grand in the way of formal staterooms. There were no thrones, no sweeping drapes, no overwhelming displays of gold and ceremony. William had specifically asked for something quieter, a room that felt like a room. Flowers had been placed on a table nearby, white ones, simple. The lighting was soft. 2 chairs had been set close together, not at a formal distance, but close, the way 2 people sit when they are speaking from the heart rather than from a script. Outside the palace gates, word had begun to spread. It always spread quickly, in the age of phones and screens and constant connection. People had gathered on the pavement, not in enormous crowds yet, but steadily, individuals who had woken to the news and felt something pull at them, some instinct to be near. To stand in the cold morning air and be present for something they could not fully name. A woman in her 60s held a small bunch of flowers she had bought from the corner shop. A young man stood with his phone lowered, not filming, just watching the gates. A group of schoolgirls in uniform had stopped on their way past, their teacher standing patiently to the side, letting them have the moment. Inside, William and Catherine made their way through the corridor toward the appointed room. Staff lined the hallway in quiet respect. People who had served the household for years, some for decades. There were no grand gestures, just small nods, soft smiles, a few hands pressed briefly together. Catherine acknowledged each face as she passed. That was who she was. She had never been able to walk past a person without seeing them. Not really seeing them, and today was no different. One older woman, a housekeeper who had been at the palace for nearly 30 years, reached out and gently touched Catherine's arm as she passed. It was a tiny movement, barely anything. Catherine paused, turned, and looked at her. No words, just a look that carried everything. The housekeeper pressed her lips together and nodded, eyes bright. Catherine gave her hand a brief, warm squeeze, and then moved on. William noticed. He always noticed those moments. It was one of the things he had watched with a steady and private admiration over all the years, the way Catherine moved through the world as though every single person in it mattered. Not as a performance, not for cameras, not for applause. Just because she genuinely believed it to be true. They reached the door of the room. One of the senior aides stood nearby, composed and professional. But there was something in his expression today, a fullness, a weight that did not belong to ordinary working hours. He opened the door for them without a word. They entered together. The cameras were already set. The technical crew silent and respectful. A few trusted journalists had been permitted to be present, people who had covered the royal family for many years and who understood, without being told, that this was not a moment for performance or spectacle. It was a moment to witness, to record honestly, to handle with care. William and Catherine took their seats. They sat close. His hand found hers on the armrest between them, and it stayed there. The statement began. William spoke first. His voice was measured but not cold. It was the voice of a man who had chosen every word with love, who had thought about the people listening, who understood that what he said today would travel far and land in places he would never see. He spoke about the years, about the work they had done together, about the causes that had mattered deeply, the mental health campaigns, the early years foundation, the countless quiet visits to hospitals and schools and community centers that had never made headlines but had changed lives. He spoke about Catherine in a way that made the room hold its breath, not with the rehearsed warmth of official speeches, but with the plain, unguarded tenderness of a man speaking about someone he loves in front of the whole world because the world deserves to know. He said that she had shown everyone what real grace looks like. Not the grace of titles or palaces, but the grace of a person who faces the hardest things and still turns toward others, still asks how you are, still remembers your name. Catherine's expression did not waver, but her eyes, those steady, composed eyes, filled slowly. She did not let the tears fall. She simply held them there, the way she had always held difficult things with dignity, but never coldness. Then it was her turn. She looked directly at the cameras, and through them at the people, the millions of people who had followed her life, celebrated with her, worried with her, prayed for her. She had always felt the weight of that attention, but she had never resented it. She had understood from the beginning that her life belonged partly to others in a way that could never be undone. And she had chosen to meet that not with withdrawal, but with openness. She thanked them, simply and sincerely. She thanked them for the letters and the flowers and the messages that had arrived during the hardest months. She said that there had been mornings when she had not known how to begin the day, and it had been the thought of those small, warm acts of kindness from strangers that had helped her take the first step. Her voice caught once, just once, a single small fracture in an otherwise steady delivery. William did not look away from her. He simply tightened his hand around hers, just slightly. A small, private gesture in the middle of a very public moment. Outside, the woman with the flowers had begun to cry. She was not the only one. The cameras captured it all. The composure, the tenderness, the one small crack in the voice, and somewhere, in living rooms and offices and coffee shops, in hospital waiting rooms across the country and across the world, people stopped what they were doing. They leaned toward their screens. They felt something they had not expected to feel on an ordinary Tuesday morning, something real. After the cameras stopped, after the journalists filed quietly out of the room, and the technical crew began packing away their equipment with careful, subdued movements, William and Catherine remained seated. Neither of them stood immediately. There was no rush, and the staff had been instructed to give them time. The room settled into a stillness that felt earned, the kind of quiet that follows not silence, something that has been said. William leaned back in his chair and exhaled. It was a long, slow breath, the kind that carries the weight of ours held tightly inside a chest. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at Catherine. She was looking at her hands again, turning her ring slightly on her finger, a small, unconscious habit he had noticed over the years, something she did when her mind was moving through things too big to say out loud. "How are you feeling?" he asked. She considered the question honestly, the way she always did. "Like I've just put something down that I didn't realize was so heavy," she said. He understood that completely. Outside, the crowd had grown. What had begun as a handful of people near the palace gates had become several hundred. The news was moving fast now, carried by phones and screens, and the old human impulse to share something that matters. People stood in clusters on the pavement, talking quietly, looking at their phones, looking at each other. Flowers had begun to appear at the gates, single roses, small bouquets, bunches of white and yellow and pale lavender, tied with string or ribbon, or nothing at all, just pressed gently against the iron bars. A palace spokesperson came out briefly to thank the public for their kindness and ask gently for calm. The spokesperson's voice was professional, but there was something soft in it, an edge of feeling that could not quite be hidden. The crowd listened. A few people applauded, not loudly, not with the roar of a celebration, but with the steady, grateful sound of people who wanted to be heard. Inside, William and Catherine moved to a smaller adjoining room where their private team had arranged tea and a little food. Neither of them ate much. They sat close, speaking in low voices, going over nothing in particular, the small, ordinary things that people reach for when the large, extraordinary things have exhausted them. He mentioned the garden, She mentioned that Louis had left his shoes in the wrong place again. Small things. Normal things. Necessary things. The children were at school. It had been a deliberate choice to keep their day as ordinary as possible. George, Charlotte, and Louis did not need to witness the formalities. They had already said their part in the private, quiet conversation of the night before, and that was enough. They needed desks and teachers and lunchboxes and the grounding regularity of an ordinary school day. William and Catherine had agreed on this without difficulty. It was the kind of parenting decision that came from years of learning together, understanding that children carry less when the structures around them stay steady. Later that afternoon, they would go and collect the children themselves. No drivers, or as few as safety would allow. They would be there at the gate. That mattered. But first, there were the calls. There are always calls on days like this. Family, senior aides. The quiet conversations that stitch together the official and the personal. William took them in turns, standing by the window again, phone to his ear, his voice low and careful. He spoke briefly with his father. That conversation was short but not cold. There are things between fathers and sons that do not require long speeches, and William and Charles had, in recent years, found a language between them that was built more on presence than on words. Catherine received a call that made her pause in the middle of the corridor. One hand pressed lightly to her chest. It was from a charity she had worked with for years, one focused on children facing serious illness. The call was not from the organization's official leadership. It was from a nurse, a woman Catherine had met during a visit some time ago. The nurse had heard the news and had simply called to say that the work had mattered, that the visits had mattered, that there were children and families who remembered her, not as a princess, or as a person who had sat beside them and listened. Catherine stood in the corridor for a moment after the call ended. The phone was still in her hand. She did not move straight away. A young assistant, passing nearby with a folder of papers, stopped. "Are you all right, Your Royal Highness?" Catherine looked up. She nodded slowly and managed a smile that was not performance, but something genuine and fragile and very human. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I think I am." The afternoon light had shifted. It came through the high palace windows at an angle now, stretching long and golden across the floors, catching the dust that moved in slow spirals through the air. It was the kind of light that belongs to the end of things. Not dark, not threatening, but deeply aware of itself. The light of late afternoon in a room where something important has just happened. Down in the street, a young girl, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, had been brought to the gates by her mother. She was holding a card she had made herself, covered in careful drawings of crowns and flowers and hearts. The kind of art that takes great effort and means everything. She pressed it carefully through the bars of the gate, her small face serious with the importance of what she was doing. A palace guard, standing just inside, watched her for a moment. Then he stepped forward, bent down slightly, and accepted the card with both hands. He looked at her and nodded very gravely. The way you nod when you are receiving something precious. The girl looked satisfied. She took her mother's hand and they walked away. The card found its way inside. These things always did on days like this. By the time William and Catherine arrived at the school to collect the children, the sky had turned the deep, cool blue of early evening. The air carried the smell of autumn wet leaves, cold stone, wood smoke from somewhere nearby. They arrived simply, as they had intended, in a single car. Stepping out onto the pavement like any other parents at the end of a school day, except that a small cluster of photographers had gathered at a careful distance, and a few parents near the gate had gone quiet at the sight of them. William noticed the shift in the atmosphere but said nothing. He simply walked forward. Catherine walked beside him. Louis came out first, as he always did, running slightly ahead of where he was supposed to be, his coat half-in, his bag bouncing. He spotted his parents from 20 feet away, and his face changed entirely. The way a child's face changes when it sees the people it belongs to. He came across the pavement at speed and landed against his mother with the full, unself-conscious force of a small boy at the end of a long day. She caught him and held him close, pressing her face into his hair for a moment. Her eyes closed briefly. She breathed. Charlotte came next, walking with her teacher. who leaned down and said something quietly to her before releasing her hand. Charlotte walked toward her parents with a composure that was remarkable for her age. That same quiet awareness that had shown itself the previous evening, but when she reached Catherine, she did not hold back. She slipped her arms around her mother's waist and pressed close, and Catherine held her with one arm. Louis still held with the other. William looked at his wife holding both of them, and something moved through his expression quickly, privately, but captured nonetheless by the long lens of one of the photographers at the gate. It was not grief exactly. It was something deeper than grief and older than sorrow. It was the look of a man who understands, in a single complete moment, exactly what he has and what it costs and what it means. George appeared last, walking with a friend, mid-conversation, but he broke off when he saw his family. He jogged the last few steps, and although he was at an age where showing too much emotion in front of peers required careful management, he allowed himself, in this moment, to simply be glad they were there. He stood close to his father. William put a hand briefly on his shoulder. George straightened slightly, as boys do when they feel steadied. They walked to the car together, the five of them, moving as a unit. The photographers took their pictures. The parents nearby watched. A few people reached for their phones, then stopped, perhaps deciding that this particular moment deserved to simply be seen rather than recorded back at the palace. The evening unfolded in the way the best family evenings do, with noise and food and the scattered disorder of three. Children re-entering their home after a day away. There were school bags dropped in the wrong place, a mild argument over the television that resolved itself within minutes, and the warm, ordinary smell of supper being prepared in the kitchen. William helped Louis with something, a drawing, perhaps, or a small puzzle sitting on the floor with him, completely absorbed. All formality gone, Catherine moved through the early evening with a lightness that surprised even herself. She had expected the day to end heavily. She had braced for a kind of collapse, not dramatic but quiet, the slow sinking that comes after great effort. Instead, she found something else, a steadiness, as though the day, for all its difficulty, had also cleared something, as though putting down the weight of a long, important chapter had left room for something simpler and truer. After the children were settled for the night, the long, patient process of bedtime stories and whispered requests for water that was never really about water, William and Catherine found themselves alone in the sitting room. A lamp was on. The fire had been lit earlier and had burned down to a warm, low glow. Tea sat on the table between them, steam rising gently. They were quiet for a while. Not the uncomfortable quiet of people who have run out of things to say, but the comfortable quiet of people who have said enough for one day and are content to simply be. William picked up his cup. "I thought it would feel worse," he said. The announcement. "I thought it would feel like something breaking." Catherine looked at the fire. "Does it?" He thought about it properly before answering. "No, it feels like something settling." She nodded slowly. That matched what she had felt standing in the corridor after the nurse's phone call. Something settling. Something finding the shape it was always meant to have. The day had been covered extensively by that point. The footage from the morning, the two of them seated together, his hand over hers. Her voice catching once had been watched millions of times across every platform. News programs had led with it. Comment pieces were already being written. People were responding with the particular mixture of sadness and warmth that honest, human moments tend to produce, an outpouring that was not about celebrity or fascination, but about recognition. People recognized something in what they had seen. Something about love and difficulty in showing up anyway. Something they had felt themselves, in their own smaller and private ways. A journalist who had been in the room that morning wrote a short piece before midnight. She had covered royals for 15 years, she said. She had sat through dozens of official statements and formal announcements. She had developed, over time, a professional armor against being moved. But today, she wrote, she had found herself sitting in her car in the palace car park for 10 minutes before she could drive away. She had not been able to explain it precisely, only that it had felt like watching something real. Inside the palace, the lamp was still on. The fire had nearly gone out. William and Catherine were still there, still quiet, still together. Outside, the flowers at the gate, continued to grow. 3 days passed before they went outside together publicly again. Not to an event, not to a ceremony, not to anything official. Just a walk. A deliberate, unhurried walk through a quiet stretch of parkland not far from the palace. In the cool gray of a November afternoon, William, Catherine, and the children, moving together along a muddy path between bare-armed trees, it was Charlotte who first noticed the people. They were not gathered in crowds. They were simply there, individuals in small groups, spaced along the edge of the path, standing quietly with flowers and cards and handwritten signs. No chanting, no pushing, no raised voices, just people standing in the cold, waiting to say something with their presence that words could not quite carry. Charlotte tugged at her mother's sleeve and pointed. Catherine looked. She stopped walking. William, a step ahead, noticed she had stopped and turned back. He followed her gaze. His jaw tightened slightly, not with displeasure, but with the effort of a man holding himself very steady. They had not planned for this. The walk had been arranged precisely because it was supposed to be private, ordinary, restorative. But the world has its own instincts, and the people of Britain had a particular feeling about this family that went beyond headlines and broadcasts. It was something older, something to do with watching a person face difficult things with honesty, feeling over years that you had come to know them, that they were, in some way, yours to stand by. William looked at Catherine. She looked at him. Some conversation passed between them that needed no words. They walked toward the people. What followed was not an official engagement. There was no protocol, no planned order, no list of names to be met and remembered. It was simply two people walking slowly along a path, accepting flowers, reading signs, looking into faces. Catherine crouched down to speak to a child in a pushchair who held out a slightly crumpled drawing with both hands, expression completely serious. William shook hands with an older man who could not seem to find what he wanted to say, settled for holding the handshake a beat longer than usual. William did not let go first. Louis characteristically had found a large stick and was dragging it through the fallen leaves, happily unconcerned with the significance of the moment. George walked close to his father. Charlotte stayed near her mother, watching everything with those clear, attentive eyes. A woman in her 70s stood at the end of a small group, holding a white rose with both hands. She did not push forward. She simply waited, and when Catherine reached her, she offered the rose and said quietly, "You gave us something to believe in." Catherine received the rose carefully. She held the woman's gaze for a long moment. "Thank you," she said, and there was nothing else to add to it. The thank you was complete. The walk lasted nearly an hour. By the end, Catherine's arms were full of flowers, so many that William had begun carrying half of them, slightly awkwardly, a bouquet in each arm, which made Louis laugh. That laugh, uncomplicated, childlike, just a boy laughing at his father holding too many flowers, cut through everything. The small cluster of photographers who had followed at a respectful distance all captured the same moment. William holding an armful of bouquets, looking slightly helpless and grinning despite himself. It was that photograph, more than any other image from those days, that moved through the world the fastest. Not the formal statement, not the held hands and the bright, steady eyes, but William, arms full of flowers given by strangers, laughing because his youngest son found it funny. Life continuing, insisting on itself, finding its way back to something light. The weeks that followed brought with them the quiet work of adjustment. There were decisions to be made, plans to be shifted, new rhythms to be found. It was not always easy. There were days that were hard in ordinary ways, and days that were hard in extraordinary ways. And the line between the two was not always clear. But the household moved forward with a steadiness that came from somewhere deep, from two people who had made a choice. Years ago, to face things together and had not yet found a reason to stop, Catherine continued her work with her foundations. In a different capacity now, at her own pace, on her own terms, she appeared at quieter events, a small school in Norfolk, a garden project run by young people, a meeting with researchers whose work she had long believed in. She was not less present. She was differently present, more selective, more intentional. Those who saw her in these settings noticed something, a quality of attention even sharper than before. As though having faced something enormous, she had emerged with less patience for anything that was not real. William continued to carry the weight of his public role, as he always had, but with something new in the way he carried it. He spoke more directly in interviews. He was less guarded, not reckless, but more willing to say the honest thing rather than the careful thing. People responded to it. They always respond when someone stops performing and simply speaks. On a Thursday morning in late November, Catherine sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a letter. It was handwritten, 3 pages. From a woman in Sheffield who had been going through her own illness at the same time Catherine had been going through hers. The woman wrote that watching Catherine had not made her feel less alone. That was the whole letter, really, stretched across 3 careful pages. That watching someone else carry something difficult had made her feel less alone. Catherine read it twice. Then she put it down on the table, pressed her hand flat on top of it, and sat quietly for a moment with her eyes closed. There are things a person does that they will never fully know the reach of. Acts of grace that travel far beyond what can be seen. Presence that lands in places the person standing in it cannot imagine. Outside the kitchen window, the garden was still bare. But at the very edge of one of the flower beds, a single green shoot had pushed through the cold earth, small, tentative, absolutely certain of itself. It was the beginning of something. It was always somehow the beginning of something.